Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our live co-parenting and coffee webinar panel from conflict to connection, navigating step-family dynamics. In today's presentation, co-hosted by Talking Parents and Stepfamily Solutions, we're breaking down the real challenges that shape life in a blended family and how they impact parents, step-parents, and children. We're very excited to welcome CEO of Stepfamily Solutions, Cameron Norman, who will be moderating our expert panel and live Q&A session today. Cameron is a nationally recognized stepfamily expert, host of the Stepmom Diaries podcast, and founder of Stepfamily Coach Academy. Cameron, thank you so much for joining us this morning to facilitate this very important topic.
Thank you so much, Heather, and welcome to all of you that are here. And I know if you're here today, chances are you are working through your own stepfamily dynamics, and we are going to cover a lot of ground today. I think we're going to send you home with some really great practical advice that you can use immediately. And I'm so pleased today to be able to chat with two of the thought leaders in this space who are using their expertise daily to help step families navigate their complicated dynamics. So we are excited to have with us today Todd Jensen, who is an assistant professor of human development and family science and director of the Thriving Through Family Transitions Research Lab in the School of Education at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And his research focuses largely on identifying factors that promote high quality step parent, stepchild relationships, particularly around adolescent children. So he's got a great background to talk about these things today. And we've got Alex Harrison, who is a licensed clinical social worker and therapist who has spent the last 15 years helping couples and families find better ways to do life together. As a blended family coach and a card carrying member of the Bonus Mom Club, welcome to that. She helps people build connection, calm the chaos, and develop the skills that work in blended family life. So I am thrilled to have you both here with us today. So I think we should just dive on in. We're going to chat about a few different buckets of things today, from, what kids in step families need to how the various roles in a step family evolve and how to improve communication. So let's start, guys. Welcome, first of all, but let's start with the kids. What do you think? Todd, maybe with you, let's talk about what are some things that kids in step families feel, but that we may not hear from them. You've done some really great research around what kids think about all of these dynamics that are happening around them.
Yeah, happy to jump in. A lot of great territory we could cover here to be sure. And I also want to acknowledge that there's bound to be lots of individual variability on this front. There may be some children within step families that have no problem at all being quite vocal about the things they want or need, whereas other children are going to be far more timid. They might withhold some of what they're thinking and feeling, sometimes to safeguard the feelings of their own parents and caregivers. They want to keep the peace, and sometimes they internalize a lot of their stress. So it's helpful to be mindful of all those potential differences. But in terms of things children might be thinking about, things they might be feeling, even if they can't put those things into words well, again, a lot of territory we could cover. I'll try to be efficient. But one might be the sense that, hey, I really hope we don't rush all of this. I really hope we can pump the brakes, explore these relationships at a tempo that feels natural and comfortable. I think another thing that many children think about, and maybe this leans into some of the emotional experience as well, fear in particular. What does this all mean for my connection with my parents? Is there going to be less time? Is there going to be less energy that my parents can devote to their relationship with me because of all of these new relationships they are now interested in and investing in and having to cultivate? And so children can be really sensitive to those types of changes. They might have long-standing patterns of interaction with their parents. They've grown accustomed to the connections they have with those caregivers. And step family formation introduces a lot of notable shifts. Another thing that I think children think about is the way that their new step parents are approaching them. And it seems that children, especially those moving into those adolescent years, those preteens and teens, They tend to prefer step parents to be authentic, to be candid, to be open, to really, to say it another way, to be themselves
Mm.
and to be open and vulnerable in ways that allows that child to really get some insight into who this person is that they're going to be developing a relationship with. I think another thing children benefit from, even if they don't have the words to say this, is that they tend to benefit tremendously when they have some amount of say in how this relationship is going to be unfolding over time. They have some say in what that relationship could or should be for that particular family at that particular time. So having some real voice and choice can really help children navigate what would otherwise be quite an uncontrollable situation for them. So
So I
those are a
love
few
that
kind of
word.
top line thoughts.
Yeah, Todd, I love that word uncontrollable because I think for kids, there's so much about the step family dynamic that is out of their control. Most of it, really, right? Like they didn't choose for their parents to split up or for whatever that loss looks like, whether it's death or divorce. They didn't choose for mom or dad to move on with someone new. They didn't choose who that person was. So I think a lot of times they do feel, out of control. And I guess that sort of leads to you said a lot that I'd love to be able to unpack all of it. I think we could do a whole separate panel discussion on that, on some of those things. But I mean, you talked about, moving a little bit slower and kind of matching the pace that the child was looking for. What are some things that parents can do to make kids feel emotionally safe to you're not going to hand over control of the family to the kids, but to make them feel a little bit more like they, have some modicum of control over their life.
Yeah, great question. And kind of leaning into that, how do we produce emotional safety for those kids in approaching these new relationships? I'll lean into that for a moment. One thing that's really showing up in my research in a powerful way is that the specific things that step parents and children do together, the ways they interact, those things definitely matter. And how those interactions happen, what those interactions feel like matter, perhaps even more. So, for example, when children sense from their new step parents that there is genuine warmth emanating from that person, this desire to really be supportive, to really be attuned to the needs of the child, frankly, when the child just feels like, hey, this person actually seems to like me and want to support me, it feels good to be in their presence. I feel good when I'm with them. That matters a lot, and that can create a lot of emotional safety, to be sure. And all of the other things happening throughout the family system matter a great deal too. How well are the parent and step parent getting along? Right? If there's a lot of conflict there, that can elevate levels of children's stress and sense of being unsafe in that environment. So they're picking up cues in these other relationships that are developing over time as well. There's a few quick thoughts there.
Oh, I think that makes so much sense. And Alex, you've seen this dynamic play out with your clients over the
Mhm.
years. Talk to us a little bit about how this kind of research and theory translates into what you've seen. And I know when we talked a little bit the other day, we talked about, how it plays out with some of the different gendered combinations of step parents and step kids. And let's talk a little bit about that too. That's all I threw a lot at you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and this is kind of coming back to that vein that Todd was mentioning around helping kids feel emotionally safe. One of the big things that really comes up with a lot of my clients is, and this is whether you're a parent or a step parent, it's showing up to kids in such a way that like allows them space to share their whole life with you, including what life is like at their other household. This is a really big one that comes up. I'll give an example. I was working with a divorced client with a daughter in middle school, and her father, so her dad in the other household, had a new partner who had just moved in. And my client was not remarried at this point. She was just dating. And the daughter, when she would come home to her mom's house after a weekend at her dad's, just seemed so careful in describing the events of the past weekend. And it was actually making my client really nervous. Like, what the heck is going on over there? And she could tell her daughter was holding back. So, some of the work that we did together was figuring out like how to show up in a way to just encourage her daughter to open up. I encouraged her to lean in next time her daughter, came home. And, she just asked her daughter, like, do you feel uncomfortable sharing with me what's going on when you spend time, with your new stepmom? And the daughter teared up, and said like, yeah, I really do. Because the truth is I have a really good time with my stepmom. Like they're like getting nails done together, and the daughter and the stepmom are both really artistic, and so they were working on art projects together. But this middle schooler, and this is very common if we're talking about gender differences and where a lot of tension and also loyalty binds lie, very, very common between a adolescent daughter and her mother, and then the tension between an adolescent daughter and a stepmom. It's that, what we call that loyalty bind of like, okay, if I lean into this relationship with my stepmom, am I somehow betraying the depth of relationship that I have with my mom? And, very fortunately in this moment, I mean, this is a kind of a pivotal moment for a parent, right? Where they can either show up to their child in a way that shows their own insecurities about this new relationship their child's forming with a step parent, and the natural consequence of that, man, that is going to be tightening up that child's sense of loyalty and that sense of stuckness between a step parent and a parent. Or a parent can show up with a lot of warmth and openness and curiosity. And the nice thing in this instance was, my client was like, I'm so glad she's doing that with her stepmom, because I'm not artsy fartsy and I don't like going to get my nails done. Like, she's able to tap into a part of my daughter that isn't natural for me to tap into. So, I was able to share with my kid, oh, I'm so glad you're having fun doing that. Keep going. And helping to give that permission to our kids that they're allowed to explore these relationships. It's so important in creating emotional
That's
safety.
so important. And I love that she was
Mhm.
able to do that. I want to flip your example on its head a little bit and ask you, for the person who's watching right now and saying, gosh, I would love to be that warm and accepting of,
Mhm.
my kid having fun with their step parent, but I don't think I've done that so far.
Mhm.
How does that person kind of flip the switch and reset that expectation? Because I think those loyalty binds are real, and if you can
Mhm.
loosen those up a little bit, it really can improve relationships with, parents and kids and step parents all the way around.
Hmm. That's a great question. So I think what's really important to think about in moments like this, because look, as parents, we all have moments where we are very aware of where we are failing, of where we are screwing up. And these are very humbling moments. And they can either be a moment where we get really stuck in a bunch of shame and guilt and feel paralyzed by it or defensive about it. Or we can see this as, instead of a pass fail, actually parenting through these kinds of process is really an issue of like, you know what? There's so much gray area. You can move towards secure functioning with your kid anytime you want. You can move towards, in small ways, of like remembering, okay, the next time my kid comes home from a weekend at their other parent's house with their parent and step parent, paying attention to like, what does my body posture look like? Am I body tight? Am I asking a lot of like very direct questions, or am I body relaxed? Am I open? Am I curious? And curious in the, as they share things with me, just, if you don't have the words inside you to say like, oh, I'm so glad you had a great time, you can just say like, oh, okay, okay. Hmm. Maybe you're not a font of like spiritual generosity and emotional generosity right now. Like, that's okay. You are where you are. So just remembering, like, can I at least be open, curious, and warm? You don't have to
Yeah.
say everything perfectly.
Yeah, I think kids really do pick up on so much more than we give them credit for. And
Mhm.
I think, you're right. It doesn't have to be the perfect words, but they'll kind of catch the spirit of where you're trying to go. And
Mhm.
it is really hard when the adults have, a lot of conflict going on between houses or whatever. I mean,
Mhm.
it's hard for mom or for stepmom, and dad or whoever to exert that sort of generous spirit about the other
Yeah.
house.
And I think if you have a kid that's, older, then maybe it is age appropriate and maybe there is a time and place. And, whether you get help from your therapist in preparing for a conversation like this or from a step family coach in preparing for a conversation like this, maybe there is a time that you sit down with your kid and take accountability of like, hey, you know, I love you so much. And sometimes like two things can be true. Sometimes it is hard for me to hear about things happening in the other house. And another thing that's true, I still really want you to have a good experience at that other house. And maybe I've been getting in the way of that, in the way that I listen and hear you when you share. I'm going to work on that,
I
you
love
know?
that. I love that. So you mentioned teenagers. So that's a great segue. Let's talk a little bit about the developmental levels of kids, right? Like we have people watching and the kids run the gamut, from the littles all the way up through teens, college and beyond. How does that developmental level play into step family life, especially like thinking about what age the kids are when they enter into step family life? And that's, I think I'll throw that to both of you. Um, because I think, you do have to kind of treat kids differently depending on where they are, right?
Mhm.
Certainly. I'm happy to jump in on this one for sure. An important point I love to make right out of the gate is that the age and developmental stage of children shapes every family of any kind, right? The way I approach parenting and caregiving tasks must adapt to the specific developmental needs of a child. So map onto all of that, all of the dynamics that come with step family formation and navigating new step family relationships. And I think we can see pretty clearly in the research data that the older the children are when these transitions happen, the more complicated it can become, in part because of the shifts in developmental needs these young people have, and because pre step family life, the longer history that is, the starker contrast it serves when the step family forms. Right. Every year, there's a delay in when a step family forms for a young child, maybe even when they're entering those adolescent years. They have a long track record to say, here's how I'm used to things happening. Here's the kind of lifestyle I'm used to. But then again, adding on to all of that, all the things that are happening in adolescence in particular, we could talk for a long time about that. Changes in the brain, changes in the entire body, changes in the kind of social mapping of what children are interested in and who they're spending their time with, shifts in cognitive abilities that position these young people quite well for some challenging things like being quite critical, being quite idealistic, and they can certainly levy that against their caregivers in very open and sometimes brutally honest ways. And so it matters a great deal, and so my research certainly shows how complicated this can be when adolescents are involved.
Mhm.
I think that's right. And the teenage thing is real, y'all. So I think that's actually a nice segue into talking a little bit about kind of how roles do shift over time, for parents and for step parents. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, Alex, in your experience, we have step parents who come in and the parent may want them to be, equal in all of the things, all of the parenting
Mhm.
roles, including, discipline and some of the other intense things that parents experience. So talk about, what that does when the step parent kind of jumps into the, instant family, big, big air quotes.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So this is one of those key areas where, and those are always the moments when I'm working with families of like, okay, I'm going to tell you something you probably don't want to hear. And here goes. This is one of those key areas where like step families just cannot be operating under the same norms as first time families. In a first time family, we commonly have both parents, collaborating together on what our shared values are, what it means, what limits look like and mean, what consequences might look like and mean, and they're exacting those limits and discipline together. And here's the thing. In a first-time family, kids are biologically wired to see both their parents as attachment figures. So they're not likely to feel like existentially threatened if either parent holds a limit or gives a consequence. But in a step family formation, kids are not predisposed to seeing their step parent as an attachment figure. So in other words, they don't see that step parent as an inherent source of comfort and unconditional love. So if a step parent takes away screens, for example, like for the rest of the night, it's going to land very differently with a kid than if their biological parent was delivering the exact same consequence the exact same way, if that makes sense. So, and I'll say this personally, as a mom who was parenting for a decade and a half before I became a step parent, this was probably the hardest reality for me to actually swallow in my own step family.
Same.
Yes, this is also one of the hardest things for my clients to hear from me, right? Like step parents jumping in too quickly and too intensely into parenting responsibilities or discipline just actually makes it harder for kids to move emotionally closer to that step parent. And it can really strengthen a lot of loyalty binds between the child and their biological parent in that household and churn up a lot of resentment that then you end up spending, months and years untangling, versus moving much more slowly and minimizing those loyalty bind traps and the amount of resentment. And I think it's hard for, like I said, both parents and step parents to accept something
And
like that.
I love, Patricia Papernow, who's very well known in the step family space, talks a lot about connection over correction.
Mm.
What does that look like in this? And how can biological parents or primary parents kind of slow themselves down? Because, I hear a lot from my clients that, the biological parent is like, well, so wait, that means I always have to be the bad cop. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry, kind of, yeah. How can they sort of slow themselves down and allow for that connection?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was literally speaking to a couple about this yesterday. The dad partner just so clearly articulated. You could just see the conflict within him of like, I don't need her to be helping me all the time, but I sure do like the help. Right. So, and I have so much empathy around this because single parenting is so tough. Those years can be just particularly exhausting. It's really hard to be in your own head trying to suss out what your kids need and what I need to do as a parent to parent them differently right now. So when you're finally partnered with somebody that you really love just so much, it makes so much sense that you want to team up.
Yeah.
But for all of these reasons that I mentioned before, we have to just kind of keep the big picture in mind. Okay, so if I decide to glue a broken handle back onto this mug, technically, yes, the handle is back on again, but it's not stable right away, right? Like my enthusiasm and love for this mug, this is my favorite mug, doesn't really change the reality that it needs time to set so that the structural integrity is there again. So I think the thing that I work with a lot of people on, and it sounds abstract but it takes some work and skill building and learning tools to support one another through the process, is that the patience really does pay off. But partners need tools to learn to support each other through those delicate first years, because it can be so painful when a parent is feeling like they're taking on the bulk of the work, and the step parent is just kind of either hanging out or feels their own sense of paralysis or is struggling to jump in. I mean, I think
Yeah.
personally that was the hardest for me. It's like I could, and the thing is about step parents too, we're in kind of a unique position because we're not deeply embedded in the family system the way a biological parent and their kids have been. So we can kind of like hover over and observe a situation from a little bit more of a distance and actually see where things might benefit from change. The problem is that when we insert ourselves into it too quickly, we're undermining our parent partner, number one, and we are taking away from that partner's ability to figure out and work it out on their own with their kids. And if we can hold back, and for some, and sometimes as a step parent, that means like you need to go exit stage left, busy yourself doing something else for a few minutes, and then on the other side of a parenting like guffaw, like if we're going to call it that, like circle back to your partner and let's talk about what happened. I mean, that's when we do like the Monday morning quarterbacking of like, how could this have gone differently, you know? And then we're collaborating together. Parents get a chance to vent. Parents get a chance to get support from their step parent partner. And then it's more of like, okay, guess what? The next meltdown's on its way tomorrow. So we are always going to have a fresh chance to like address this issue, right?
That is true.
Like the one thing I can tell you with 4 children, 2 of my own and 2 stepchildren is like, ooh, the do-overs abound because there's always shenanigans coming down the line, right?
That is so true. That is so true.
Mhm.
And Todd, from the research perspective, what is the best way for parents and for step parents to talk to the step kids about kind of setting up the relationship that works for them while they're trying to normalize all this, and playing the long game and taking the time to let the mug set. I love that analogy, Alex. What's the best way for step parents to talk to their step kids about all this?
Yeah, some of the comments that Alex was sharing reminded me of some of the findings from my research where these young adolescent respondents in some of my studies, they speak to this a little bit. They, in particular, this instinct that step parents might understandably have to try to make contributions, right? That kind of outsider's perspective can have a lot of value. They can see things that might be in the blind spots of the other caregivers. And one thing these young respondents highlight is that they are sensitive to when they feel a step parent is in some way trying to fix something, and they don't
Mm,
typically respond well to it when it's approached from that mindset of like, oh, this person's coming in and they might mean well, but it looks like they're trying to fix a problem, or they are trying to serve a particular function that might in essence replace the function of another caregiver. And instead what these young people seem to yearn for is step parents coming in and finding where their unique contributions might be in the lives of those new stepchildren. What's something unique? What's something distinct? What's something creative that we can build together that works well for us and sits outside of any effort to fix something or to replace something, but it's meaningful in its own right, and
mhm.
serves a real powerful function for these young people. I don't know. I might have wandered off the farm a bit there, but
No, I think that's great. And I love the opportunity of kind of the step parent being able to have open conversation with the step kids. One of the things we did in our step family that I thought worked well with our step kids is, we once we understood the discipline part, and Alex, you're right, that is something, I mean, I fell into that early on too. Once we understood that and my husband started doing the discipline, he would have, an exchange or whatever with one of the step kids, and then I would kind of come in after the fact and go into their room and say, "Hey, that was really tough. How you feeling?" And have an opportunity for them to talk about it, but not in a way that I'm sort of
Mhm.
trying to say, hey, dad was right, and boy, you really messed up here. I more was coming in and saying, hey, let's talk about it, and let's kind of call out and I also like that idea of calling out the elephant in the room, like, hey, I'm not your mom or dad. But we're not going to have that relationship, but you and I, stepchild to step parent, get to figure out what our relationship looks like. What do you think about that? And kind of
Very
giving them a
powerful.
little bit of ownership in the relationship, and because I think, again, back to the control thing, they feel like they have no control over any of this stuff. So if we can sort of give them a little bit of that back, I think that, seems to help a little.
I agree. I think there's something incredibly powerful about inviting that elephant right into the room and
Yeah.
talking about it. There's such a power and kind of an overlooked power in making things explicit and just putting things on the table and talking about things in a very open way. And of course, there can be natural reasons we might resist doing that. These can be emotionally charged topics. They might hit some emotional bruises we're carrying with us from past relationship experiences. But you're touching on some really important things that youth seem to highlight in the research as well. When it comes to approaching these conversations about building the step parent child relationship, how can we make that a low pressure situation? How can we provide agency to the fullest extent possible to these young people, enabling them to, in some respects, set the pace of things, to at least give voice to what their priorities and preferences might be? Can we do this in a way that is very transparent? Can we do this in a way that offers clarity and honesty and openness to say, hey, let's find a role for me as a new step parent, for you as my new stepchild that just makes sense for us. We can tune out the voices we're getting from society, from our community, from other family members, and let's just think about what actually makes sense for us and have this be a very collaborative experience. That's age appropriate, that's developmentally appropriate, of course. But yeah, you struck on some really important ground there, Cameron.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
well, I was just going to say, I think like it's challenging for both parents and step parents, because we feel so much pressure when we form this new family to like fix what's broken and get it right, so it sticks, so it works, so we don't end up with another situation of brokenness, right? And I think that's where, when that pressure is building, it can drive us to do a lot of like over functioning and kind of fear-based stuff that like we wouldn't necessarily do otherwise, trying to like make connection happen, make relationship happen. And I think getting this information about like what kids of different ages are actually saying helps them is that really good piece of information that can help us as step parents and parents to really slow down and learn to trust a process and learn how to, like find your own groove with each other. And I think this is another concept that Patricia Papper now speaks about a lot, rather than like the face-to-face time between a step parent and a stepchild, shoulder to shoulder time, doing things that are like hanging out adjacent. For my husband, step parenting my teenage daughter, it was taking her out and teaching her how to drive. Because guess who was too
I love
nervous
that.
and crazy to take their child out to drive? Me. So he was right there to take care of that. It was a great time for them. And for me, with my like stepsons who were younger, sitting across from them and trying to have a deep conversation, that's not going to fly. But if it's like, hey, why don't we make some pickles? Why don't you scrub a bunch of cucumbers? And they're like at the sink scrubbing away, and I'm like getting jars ready, and we're just hanging out, and it's low pressure. There's no perfect way to do it. And, those little moments, or even like the sacred in between time that happens when you're, on the occasion that you drive a stepchild to and from an activity, these small windows. This is not about intentional quality time. This is about just casual hangout time. Maybe they're getting to DJ the music, and it's going to be, in our household, it's going to be like Imagine Dragons on repeat, which, that's a lot for me after a song or two. But it's what the boys really love. And I kind of really get my rocks off watching them dance and sing in the back seat, and them being like comfortable with me being comfortable with them. Those are important moments. And those kinds of casual, low key, less than intentional kinds of interactions really add up over time in
Yes.
ways that kids can then come back and say, like, I feel comfortable, I feel safe.
I love that point because as much intention as we generally have to put into step family life, it is those unintentional moments that matter. And I love car time. I think that you can get some really great interactions because, to your point, they're not sort of having to have this face-to-face conversation that may feel a little high pressure for a kid. You're shoulder to shoulder in the car,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll say stuff that I think they wouldn't necessarily say otherwise. It's really great.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about parenting styles. I know I hear a lot from my clients about, when they're building a step family, the primary parent or the biological parent has one parenting style, the step parent has a totally different parenting style, and that's putting aside any differences you may have with the other house, right? So lots of opportunities for conflict amongst, permissive parenting versus authoritative. Talk to me a little bit about that, maybe Todd, if you want to jump in on that, and how the differences impact step families and how they can navigate some of those differences in parenting styles, because you're not going to ever be 100% the same on parenting styles. So how do you sort of mesh that together?
Yeah, really important topic. And here, I guess I can also appeal to our good friend, Patricia Papernow, who's written extensively about this particular challenge where, as step families are forming and these relationships are developing, there can be a gravitational pull for primary parents, parents of origin, to kind of shift a little bit more into a more permissive manifestation of their parenting, often to counterbalance maybe a new step parent coming in who feels a little more comfortable moving into more, I hesitate to call it authoritarian, but just a more kind of behavioral control
More
approach toward
strict.
children, a little more
Mhm.
strict, a little more just kind of, hard line. And so there can be this challenging balancing act all on top of what might be just natural parenting style differences rooted in one's own experience, being in a family, having parenting experiences accumulated over time. And so, again, I think there's a real power of awareness in this, and a real power to having conversation about this, making things explicit, sharing observations that partners are having, and trying to find, even if in a private setting, which would probably be a great place to do that, trying to find alignment
Mhm.
and trying to get on the same page. Children note in some of my own research how much they are sensitive to whether or not a parent and step parent are aligned
Mm-hmm.
in how parenting is happening and what sorts of parenting tasks are being done and by whom. And so there seems to be real value in striving to get on the same page, between parent and step parent, doing so in as calm and a direct way as possible, avoiding undermining each other, openly in front of the children, just really creating role clarity, creating a clear distinction between, who is doing what task and at what time, and overall striving for a low conflict approach. This all sounds incredibly idealistic, and let me acknowledge that. Doesn't that sound amazing? So much easier said than done, to be sure. But I think if all of this can be rooted in the well-being and development of children, if that can be the heartbeat of all of this, that I think can help us as caregivers overcome, manage, confront some of the challenges that we're having in doing all of this
Mhm.
that we're laying out. If we can put that front and center to the fullest extent possible, that
Yeah,
can be a powerful fuel source for us.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Yeah, kids front and center. I love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, Alex, before we move on to communication issues, which I think is going to be a big one for folks, let's talk a little bit about, when you have a situation where, someone's been single parenting for a while,
Mhm.
kids play a little bit of a different role in terms of decision making in the family, right? Like they get a little bit more deference, but like a little more involvement in the decision
Yeah.
making. And then when a new step parent comes in, I think there's some natural tension because all of a sudden they're playing a bigger role in decision making, and the kid is sort of removed from that role that they felt like they had been in and had some control. How do you
Mhm.
how do you navigate that?
Oh, tricky and carefully. So, yeah, I think this is extremely common, and it is more intense. I think I'll say this anecdotally. I think it's more intense when you have, older children, like kids that are like 9, 10, and into adolescence. Because it kind of makes sense when you're single parenting, you come home at the end of the day, it's easy to fall into the pattern of asking your 12-year-old, like, hey, what should we do for dinner tonight? Or what should we do this weekend? Because these are conversations that normally you'd be having with a partner, and you and your partner would kind of make that joint decision together and then deliver the information to kids. But when you have, like, when you're a dad and you say have like a 16-year-old daughter at home with you, it's really, really natural to fall into starting to have those types of decision making conversations with your teenage kid, right? Makes sense in the short term and doesn't feel super sustainable in the long term. Now, stepmom comes into the picture. Oh boy. Now we have stepmom and dad who are suddenly making the decisions, and daughter is extremely thrown off base because it's like, wait, why am I not being consulted about our weekend plans or where we're going on vacation this summer? Or what can also happen is that realignment doesn't happen particularly naturally. And, like, say, parent and teenage child are still making those decisions, and step parent is somehow just supposed to be like along for the ride and just folding right in. That can also create a lot of problems in the step couple's relationship, right? So realignment is necessary, and it takes some time. I think, one of the things that I try to work with people, especially on the front end, if they are working towards blending but haven't yet blended, that is a great time for parents to start doing that realignment apart from step parent being in the household, because the feel of that is going to feel much more parent directed instead of step parent pressured, and that can help kids tremendously. I mean, I think anytime that parents can start to make adjustments towards more authoritative parenting, so that's like that lovely sweet spot of warmth, responsiveness, but also firm limits and reasonable expectations that align for that kid's developmental process, right? Um, Anytime parents can start making those steps outside of the step parent being around, oh, snaps. That's where we want to be.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. We are getting some amazing questions coming in, and we'll tackle all those kind of as we wrap up the conversation. We'll move into Q&A, but I encourage anybody watching, like, shoot your questions into the chat, and we've got some great ones that we'll get to. But let's pivot and talk a little bit about communications and boundaries and kind of managing the relationships between the houses, because that can be a real challenge, especially when there's high conflict between homes. Um, Alex, you work with a lot of clients who are dealing with some of these challenges. Talk to us about some of the common things that you see.
Yeah, so I would say probably the two big pitfalls that are most common with communication across step family households, they're kind of two variations on the same theme. One is, and again, this makes so much natural sense, right? If I have two co-parents that are, not getting along so well, or what we might call high conflict, it makes so much natural sense that a parent might want to farm out some of that communication with their difficult ex-spouse and co-parent with their current step-parent partner, especially if that step-parent partner is willing and volunteering themselves to do so. This is a trap. Another similar trap is inserting, and I see this all the time, people getting into co-parents and adding in step parent into a group text around all
Yeah.
parenting issues. Again, sounds like, well, oh, doesn't this just make practical sense because we're, not having to have so many points of communication? If we can just keep it all centralized, isn't that just easier? No, it's not easier, not at all. And I'll tell you why. It creates, number one, it pressurizes step parents to be inserting themselves in positions where they're making parenting decisions and logistical decisions. It puts them in positions of parenting and discipline too soon, too much, too early. And it also can be extremely triggering for a co-parent in the other household to suddenly feel that this step parent is being elevated into an equal position for decision making. So I think, best practices, we really need to keep the parenting as much as possible, especially in those early years, between co-parents. Where co-parents are making joint decisions, they are the ones in primary communication via text or talking parents or over the phone, whatever is working best. And then parents need to be responsible deliverers of that information to their step parent partner. And
I
which is,
love all of that. And I really, I want to underscore that because I think that that is such a common pitfall that new step families fall into, including my own. I mean, I see it all the time with clients, and we made that mistake early on. You have a spouse who is, well, you're both. I mean, the step parent and the parent are really excited to have found each other. They're happy. They want to jump into this new family, with all the things, and step parents should be involved in all the things. And, they're getting added to all the text chains and everything. And I think that can put a lot, I mean, I think you're exactly right. It can put a lot of pressure on everybody to operate in a system that isn't really meant to operate that way, right?
mm-mm. No,
Um,
sometimes it works, but more often than not, I see that it adds a lot of role confusion and makes, I think, the boundaries a lot more
yeah.
blurry and difficult.
Yeah, and you're right. There are situations where everybody gets along and it can be totally, and I applaud families that do that. But I think especially when you're talking about the high conflict, that's exactly right. Well, let's talk a little bit. You know, we talked earlier, kind of alluded to communicating with the stepkids and how parents sort of hold themselves about, how they communicate information to the kids. When you have difficult communication between homes, for example, when a kid comes over and says, I heard this about you, and mom says you're a real, or whatever that looks like. Kids are delivering information about what has happened at the other house. Talk to me about the importance of how you receive that information from kids and how that can contribute to the challenges between homes.
Todd, I'll let you take this one to start.
Yeah, I'll get the ball rolling. This is really challenging. I don't I struggle to imagine a single human being who likes to receive negative information about themselves, especially as
Right.
conveyed through children they're supporting and providing care for. So these kind of higher conflict situations, these more high tense situations between caregivers, between step parents and maybe a non-resident parent, these are really tricky situations to navigate. What I can say, maybe as just an effort to provide motivation for step parents to exert that superhuman effort to rise above what feelings those experiences might be yielding. Children observe these reactions. So if a child conveys some hard information, say from their other household to a step parent, the way the step parent reacts to that and the way they do so consistently over time, is incredibly powerful. It's hard to overstate how much respect children actually start to build towards step parents when they see those step parents weathering this drama with a certain amount of zen and calmness and stoicism. The children really begin to, and even in some instances, sympathize with their step parent over the non-resident parent. They're saying, wow, my other parent's making this really difficult for my step parent. And from my vantage point, this doesn't at all seem justified. It doesn't at all seem fair. And they start to build empathy in a lot of these situations for their step parent. And so, as hard as it can be, to the extent a step parent can try to weather those moments calmly and well, it can pay huge dividends over time. And so I do really see that as an investment that you can make, and it can actually roll into the development of a positive relationship with those children over time. So those are some initial thoughts.
And I
Mhm.
think you used the word at the beginning, superhuman, because it is really difficult um, to not have a reaction when someone comes over. I mean, Alex, what are some things that you can say? I mean, I know we've used in the past, hey, I'm sorry you had to hear that. What is your experience with this? I
Mhm.
mean, what are some practical ways that that can sort of be de-escalated, whether it's through the step parent or the parent doing so?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, yeah, like Pat was saying, like fielding a sudden, like very negative report around what, another parent in another household or another step parent said about you, being able to just like take a breath and say, I mean, something to the effect of like, oh boy, or like, oh dear, I bet that was interesting to hear. Or like, yeah, I'm wondering if that was hard for you to hear. Just kind of hanging in that place where it's like curious, open, kind of neutral, but we're not pretending that like that didn't touch us. I mean,
Right.
like, I think figuring out how to walk this, like, again, very difficult line of you get to be a human who's impacted by incoming, but we're not suddenly making it all about us. We're not suddenly preaching about what a not okay person this other human is in the other household. And we're certainly not going to like start giving directives on how this child needs to show up to this because none of this was ever their choice in the first place. So again, like being able to just like, oh, wow. Okay. Don't love hearing that. Or like, oh, I imagine that was hard for you to hear. Like, what was that like? Because I think the other thing is that kids really do see the contrast. And this is a tough, again, like it's easier for us to stay calm when we can remember how, like, and channel the empathy for what a crappy burden it is for a kid to hold this dissonant, uh, this distance between what my parent says my stepmom is and how I actually experience my stepmom. Those feel very, very different. And that's something that kids then have to figure out how to reconcile through their childhood. So that's hard enough. So if we really want to show love to our kids, it's figuring out how to like sit with them in that space rather than add to the burden of that space. Um,
Yeah,
I
I
don't know if
love
that
that. And
answers the
like
question.
exercising some empathy around, what they're going through. I mean, I know I talk to
Mhm.
a lot of parents and step parents who like are really impacted by some of these statements, but if we can kind
Mhm.
of pull ourselves out of it and think about how kiddo may have heard that, and as you said, kiddo didn't choose any of this. And
Mhm.
like let's kind of pull back and think about the impact that this is all having on them, and exercise a little bit of empathy there. I think that can go a really long way. And I love the idea, Alex, of encouraging some analytical thought. I think as they get older, they do sort of recognize, that there's a little bit of a dissonance,
Mhm.
between what they see and what they hear. And, in subtle, curious ways, we can kind of encourage them to exercise a little bit of independent thinking.
Well, especially with like kids that are becoming adolescents, they're experiencing this naturally at school. For example, like, well, so and so says that my friend is lame. It's like, well, okay, that means your kid is having to do the work of figuring out, like, is my friend lame? Actually, no, I like her. So what does that mean? I mean, if you can help draw the parallels, and again, this takes like some practicing to do with your stepkids and with your kids, but helping them understand the like in their own life and other contexts, what it's like for them to learn how to judge their own experience and their other
Mm-hmm.
relationships. You're kind of like scaffolding them with these skills to be able to then like contextualize to their family experience later,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. I love that. Well, with a little bit of time we have left, let's talk a little bit about a buzzword that we hear all over social media today, and that is boundaries.
Mm.
Um, let's talk a little bit about what they look like around some of the communication between homes. And Alex, you mentioned the Talking Parents app, using
Mhm.
technology to sort of set some of those boundaries around communication and help improve some of that, I think can be really helpful. But like, let's talk a little bit about, how a step family can set some boundaries with the other house, when the text is blowing up at all hours and, what that looks like, what are they? I'll let, Alex or Todd, whichever one of y'all wants to start the ball on that.
I mean, Todd, is there some research stuff you want to zero in on first?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. This is another area I think we see just a tremendous amount of variability.
Hmm.
We see some step families where there's quite a united front across the entire co-parenting network. It really is this team of caregivers that are in business together to take care of the key parenting tasks that need to get taken care of, and they do it in an amicable way, in a cooperative way. Um, don't know that that's the majority experience. I don't know that I could quantify the proportion of step families that take that form, because there certainly are other cases where it is much more conflictual, it is much more divided. And one thing I would say is that in those contexts, trying to clearly identify all of the controllable factors, all of those things that are actually in my control in this household in which I reside, what can I do in this space to ensure the well-being of these kids, to promote relationship development for all of us involved in this household. And so in terms of what specific boundaries might look like to safeguard that, that's going to look highly individual depending on the
Mhm.
characteristics of these other caregivers. I think, in different settings that I find myself presenting in, maybe the most specific questions I get are about this very topic. Hey, here's my situation. I have an ex-partner who, is thinking about getting a car for our 15-year-old, but if they get that car, they can't use it when they're in my house. And so, like, this is where we get into really specific areas. And so in terms of general principles, I'm kind of leaning on that idea of what can I control and what can't I, and what are
Mhm.
some tools that I can put into place to help myself not
Mhm.
ruminate over the uncontrollables, as hard as that is. But I'm happy
Mhm.
to transition over to Alex, who probably has some good practical insights here too.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I mean, it's highly individualized stuff. I think if we wanted to talk about physical boundaries around communication, there are some good standards around that. Like, for example, if you're the one with custodial time right now with your kids and your co-parent is endlessly texting you or calling you past 7 p.m. about parenting issues, well, maybe that's not something that you owe them responses around immediately. It's not an emergency. Figuring out, like, using that good old Biff method, right? Of like brief, informative, friendly, and firm, of like, hey, I recognize that you want to talk about this topic with the kids in school. I'm happy to talk to you about it sometime over the next couple days. Here are some of my available times. What would work for you? So that you are being relational. We're not walled off, right? We're not shutting down the conversation. We're recognizing, like, yep, this conversation needs to happen, but we're also not boundaryless and acting like every moment of our time, as long as it's about the kids, is open for connection, right? Because number one, that's exhausting and it's unsustainable. No one can talk about parenting all day long, every day after 7 p.m. And it's really not part of creating a good, secure relationship between you and your step parent partner. So figuring out boundaries around that is really important. The other thing I would say about boundaries, it's not just about what you will and won't do and physical boundaries and when I can see you and when we'll get together and talk. Boundaries, especially like, look, if it's my client on the couch with me and we're talking about step family dynamic stuff, the co-parent most of the time isn't there. Although sometimes I do work with everybody in one room and that's bananas. But most of the time it's just you. So most of the time, the work of boundaries is actually pretty internal. It's figuring out how to get a better understanding of this like little semi-permeable skin between me and the world, and figuring out what does it look like to use appropriate containing boundaries. Like, for example, just because I feel like something is objectively true doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be explicitly stated. Sometimes containment is actually a really smart idea, right? Also, learning how to manage my internal boundary when I've got so much incoming, so much criticism and imperatives coming in my direction from my high conflict co-parent, for example. And this is a concept that I love working with my stepfamily coaching clients around. It's a skill that's taken from relational life therapy, and it goes something like this: when you are feeling that like whoosh of your body reacting to incoming, that criticism, that imperative that your high conflict co-parent is coming at you with, what you need to be doing, what you have to do differently, or who you are or aren't, you can do this. You ask yourself 2 questions. Is it true subjectively to me? Is this true? And is it actually about me? Or is it really about them and their stuff, their feelings, their baggage, their mission, right? And if the answer to both of those questions is no, I don't think it's true that I have to show up to this practice just to watch, or to this game this week. And actually, no, I don't think this is about me. I think this is about my co-parents' anxiety and insecurity. So we don't have to, number one, let it in. It doesn't need to like make its way into our, like the way we think about and see ourselves, and immediately shape our behavior and how we respond. Even like taking the time to like hold criticism and imperatives through this lens of discernment creates that space that we need to calm down, remember what kind of values we're trying to parent from and be grounded in, and can really give us that space that we need to show up differently versus from a really reactive or defensive place that can escalate and contribute to more conflict.
I love that little exercise, just the 2 simple
Mm-hmm.
questions. Is it true? Is it about me? I think that is fabulous. And I hope that everybody watching will use that. I think that's really great. One of the things around boundaries that I hear a lot is, well, I set a boundary of this, and the other house, the other parent won't respect my boundary. And I know we could do a whole separate panel on like how to come up with good boundaries and, implement them, but give us a few suggestions how to deal with that, because I think, ultimately boundaries are not for other people, right? They're for us. And
Mm-hmm.
so how can we implement them when we see someone that isn't kind of quote respecting our boundaries, or someone who keeps trying to push on them?
I mean, I think that's a really tough one, right? Because then we have to like readjust like the idea of what we're willing to accept. And sometimes that's where, we have to level up in terms of the amount of support we're getting. I think this is one of those key places where there's like the huge benefit of getting emotional and practical support from a good therapist, from a good step family coach. And by the way, I just want to qualify a good therapist who really understands step family dynamics, because
Yes.
we can have a great therapist full of empathy, full of great tools and tricks. But if they are primarily operating from the lens of what works in first time families, and or in couples therapists that really most of their experience is rooted in just working with first time couples, it's going to be really hard for you to get the support that you need, considering the nuance and depth and complication that comes with the step family dynamic,
I'm
right?
so
So
glad you said that. That's so important.
so step family coaches, therapists that really understand step family dynamics, a great source of support. This is also one of those places where apps like Talking Parents are extremely helpful, because they create these wonderful guardrails around communication that then, if need be, can be utilized in, leveled up interventions like mediation, for example, which is another practical place to go if we're deadlocked around how boundaries are and are not being respected. That there's other paths forward. And while that's certainly not my lane, I absolutely understand that sometimes when we get to a place where boundaries are just being, thrown to the wind and trounced all over the place, sometimes we do need that kind of support.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we have got a ton of questions, so let's jump into some of our questions that have come in, and I am just going to start with we have a biological father who is keeping his son from bonding with his stepdad and telling our son and me that he is not his dad. How can I help our son become more open to my husband? So this is from a primary parent whose husband is the stepdad. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do one of y'all want to take that one to start? I feel like I've been chatting a lot.
Did the scenario mention that child's age
Did
by chance?
not.
Okay. That is really tricky. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot for that child to carry. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, when a parent plays into those types of loyalty binds, that's really really challenging. And so I ask about the child's age in part because there may be opportunities to approach the child and say, "Hey, what would help you feel comfortable exploring this new relationship with my partner, your stepfather, in a way that you're still feeling loyal to your father? What are some first steps we could take in exploring that relationship in ways that feel comfortable to you?" So, I mean, there might be opportunity there to bring the child into those conversations and just say, "Hey, how could we approach this in a way that would make you as comfortable as possible
Yeah.
exploring this?"
And I
Mm-hmm.
wonder, having a conversation with the son and say, no, he's not your dad, but
Mm-hmm.
he's a part of this family. And you're going to have a different relationship with him than you have with your dad or with me, but you guys get to navigate that, and it's a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah, build
Mm-hmm.
something. Get creative. This can
Mm-hmm.
be something you never thought was possible. That could be really rewarding for both of you. Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I think it's very much like what we've spoken to earlier, which is like name the elephant, like name it to tame
Mhm.
it, of like, yeah, he's totally not. That's true. Yeah. And like, you know what? I'm not trying to make him that for you either. It's
Yeah.
okay. You don't have to think of him that way. You never have to think of him that way. I wonder what it might look like down the road, like what you may like end up seeing him as in your life.
I love
Yes,
that.
it's all about the curiosity. I will say at the other, I mean, there's, not knowing a lot of details about this question, sometimes the parent is just sabotaging the relationship because of their own stuff and feeling,
Hmm.
encroached upon as like a source of, as the primary place of like love and attachment, blah, blah, blah. Or is this a parent who's hearing a bunch of stuff about how stepdad is exacting discipline and a lot of parenting and overstepping and saying things like, he's not your father. He shouldn't be doing that. We don't quite know the whole picture there. So I would say it sounds like mom, we're talking to in this moment, maybe get a little bit curious about, is this criticism about the way that stepdad is interacting with your child? Or is this just, and if so, maybe that's a good moment for like reflection for you and your step parent partner? Or is this really just, again, this is like, is it true? And is it about me? Right? Is it actually about the stepdad, or is it actually about parent, co-parent?
Mm-hmm.
Great
Yeah,
points.
that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you touch on toddlerhood and being the biological mom of a 1-year-old who has a stepmom who she calls mommy? How can I support that, but also have her know that I am her mother when she grows up?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, wonderful that you want to support that.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
what do you guys think about that?
Well, I think it's, again, like, ugh, look, as a mom who has not experienced this particular thing directly, but that's just gotta sting. That's just gotta, like it, pierce our marshmallow hearts in
I
a way.
know,
I'm just like, oh, I don't want someone else to take my
I
place in my
know.
kid's heart or in their minds. Like, this is such a tough spot. And I would say that this is one of those moments where, the skill is learning how to hold and experience this very complicated type of grief, right? The grief that comes with knowing I'm sharing my child with somebody else, with another caregiver who is going to be an important part of their life coming in at one,
Mm-hmm.
right? And recognizing that, like, man, like, these parent child and child step parent relationships are long game relationships. They move and change so much over time. And sometimes as parents, we got to figure out how to trust the love that we have for our kids and that our kids have for us, to trust that this relationship is real and not going anywhere. Um, and, what kids really need to feel safe and to feel as they move through childhood that that they're not stuck in a loyalty bind, is to feel that they can use the language that makes sense to them. I mean, a 1 year
Right.
old doesn't have a lot, has almost no language capability, right? Very, very limited. So we're not, they're going to call an apple an apple. It's not going to be a Granny Smith or a Honeycrisp, right? So let's not get into the weeds with language a little too much. Like, let's let this kid develop as they develop and understand that, like, their name for their stepmom may likely change over time. And we'll just kind of sit as like a curious observer of that. I say all of this again with all the empathy in the world of, like, how tender this feels.
Yeah, and I love that this the person that asked this question is coming into it with a how can I support this? I mean, like how can I support
Mm-hmm.
this child in this relationship? And I think that is such a great place to start. How can we
Mm-hmm.
work together on all of this? And Todd, you were going to say something.
Yeah, that was all beautifully said. And I'm coming at this with a lot of empathy too, as a parent of a young one. I have a colleague who's jumping into some in-depth qualitative research on a topic that I think is relevant here, and it's a focus on allyship between parent and step parent. I mean, like a non-resident, say, father and a stepfather, and how that relationship unfolds and what seems to help that relationship come together in a way that's really unifying. Because I think that could be a really potentially interesting ingredient here, to the extent you as a parent and a step parent in another household are coming together to form a real meaningful bond with each other. Could there then be room for each other to delight in the connection that the other is forming with this child? You are expanding the village of caregiving for your kid. And from that, a relationship you have as caregivers, could that be fertile ground for that type of delight in kind of
Hmm.
spreading that wealth? Um, I'm just hinting at this. There's more research being done on this that's actually currently underway, but I'll be interested to see where the research goes here too.
Yeah, that's great. And this next question is a little bit of a variation on this. My son is 12 and thinks that upsetting his father or calling his stepmom anything outside of mom is considered disrespectful, and he doesn't want to upset his father. How do I protect him from that so he can be himself without fearing repercussions from his dad? He lives with me. We live in different counties, so the time with his dad is limited. That's hard.
That is hard. Um, this is hard because we might not be able to control dad.
Right.
on this front, because I'm having a lot of reactions to this in terms of what the ideal scenario would be for me. If I could wave my magic wand and have dad think about this differently, I would love to wave that wand. Because, yeah, ideally, that 12-year-old would have some voice and choice over the types of labels they might
Right.
feel comfortable using for their new step parent. And I personally would love to see that. Can we get dad to change his mind? I don't know. And
Yeah.
that's the sticking point here.
Yeah, I think this is a real tricky situation, because
Hmm.
as parents we often hear tidbits from the other house that we know we can't change. And I think, figuring out, man, sometimes I think, as I work with families, and sometimes I experience this myself, there's this question always of like, is this a hill I want to die on? Will it be productive, or will it continue, like, contribute to more tension, right? Because at the end
Right.
of the day, what we really don't want, because we know that it affects kids more than anything else, is felt tension and conflict between parents,
Right. No,
right?
that's so important.
So this is one of those, like, okay, your co-parent better than I do, better than any of us in this room do right now. Is this a human that you can, have a coffee meeting with, or have a phone call with, and raise a concern? Hey, here's what I'm hearing. Here's what I'm wondering. So it's I think, like, this is a lovely, low conflict way of bringing up your concerns. You lead with noticing and curiosity. I'm noticing that our son is making comments to this effect around being uncomfortable. I'm curious about how this conversation around what she is to be called has been happening between the two of you. Like, what's that been like for you? And
Love that.
opening the door to a potential pivot of, like, I'm actually wondering if he might feel closer to his stepmom if he could make the call of how he names it himself, because actually, like, I think that would be really good for him. That's very different from firing shots at our co-parent and
Yes.
making demands, right?
I love phrasing it that way instead of, being accusatory or angry or coming at it from that perspective. I think is so productive. That's
Mhm.
really great. Um, okay, what if the stepchild has a better connection with you, the step parent, than the bio dad? I am fine with it. I feel like I'm the bridge between them for having a relationship. However, it can't stay like this forever. How or when do I step back and not be the bridge so much? It's to a point where he won't even come visit for dad's time unless I am there. Also, his dad has done nothing for this to happen. So it's not, this is from stepmom. So child has a better connection with stepmom than with bio dad.
Hmm.
That's hard.
Either one of you guys want to field that one first?
This is reminding me of some scenarios that I've seen show up in my research where a young person does seem to have a stronger connection with a step parent than their resident parent or non-resident parent even. And in some respects, that relationship does seem to serve a compensatory function. It's compensating for the absence of connection between child and other caregivers. And it can be incredibly powerful and very positive. Um, what can we do to try to allocate investments in these other relationships? uh, I might have to know more about that resident parent and things they
Mhm.
are or are not doing to invest in that relationship. Yeah, I think I would need some more variables to better understand what might help.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to agree. I think my intuition on this is that when it comes to, was this a 12-year-old?
Does not
Didn't
say.
say. I mean, I think this also kind of, we get into hairy territory about the age of the child, and, making decisions about whether or not they're going to come over to a parent's house during their custodial time. I think, I'll say, as a broad and general statement, very often when we have kids that are making decisions to refuse to go to a parent's house. And I'm talking about kids like under 12, like 12 and under, 13 and under, you know, it, I think this is a parenting concern of co-parents who have really not set great boundaries together around like, uh, your dad's time is your dad's time. It is happening. Mom's time is mom's time. It is happening. You know, here's where authoritative parenting really comes into play and is so important. I know it's hard for you at dad's house. I know you're not that excited about going, and it is happening. You know, when we
Yeah.
decide that we're going to accommodate and change the plan based on kids' feelings about whether or not they want to go over to parents' house, and if everything is okay, if this is a safe, stable person, then, you know, it's happening. You know, we do
Yeah.
not, accommodation is not our best route over time with kids, because guess what? Kids' feelings change all the time.
All the time.
Kids' opinions change all the time. And if we're making big parenting decisions based on like the weather of our, like our emotional temperature of our kids, we are erring, you
Yeah.
know? So I would say, like, let's make sure that as co-parents, like, we're protecting the schedule, and empathizing with, like, okay, preference is preference. I'm not feeling close to dad. And guess what? We don't always feel, even in first time families, we don't always feel super close to one parent or another at all times. Like,
Right.
these relationships breathe, they expand and contract and change.
Yeah.
And so I guess as a
I love
step
that.
parent, with the question, which was like, where are her boundaries? I would say she can help, um, by being a supportive step parent and encouraging the two of them, the two co-parents, to like keep keep things scheduled and parent in that authoritative place.
Yeah. This is more of a broad one. Can you please touch on a co-parent who is not involved or is involved incredibly sporadically and the step parent dynamics? Child is 4 years old.
Say that one more time.
So can you please touch on a co-parent who's not involved or involved very sporadically and the step parent dynamics? So I think that is, I am assuming the child is 4 years old. I'm assuming that that's maybe getting at the role of the step parent when you
Mm-hmm.
have the co-parent who is kind of not around.
Mm-hmm. Todd, do you have any thoughts on that one to start?
If you do, jump in, but
Okay.
otherwise, okay.
Sure. I mean, I think in a situation like this, it's tricky because two things are happening. More likely than not, you're going to have I mean, small children, I think developmentally, when they're in step family dynamics, are more inclined to see a step parent as a parent figure, as an authority figure. They ease into that relationship, I think, a lot more
Yeah.
easily, than older kids do. So while in that respect, things might feel a little easier. I think the other thing that is to be acknowledged is that there's probably more than likely an undercurrent of grief happening here, where, you know, kids, whether or not they have their biological parent in their life, close or not, they're going to feel the longing for that parent. Um, and so figuring out how to hold space for that and acknowledge that that's really real, I think, is really important in helping kids
Mhm.
adjust to whatever the current reality is of their step family formation
Yeah.
and where co-parent is and isn't. That's, again, very broad, but the question was pretty broad.
Yeah. So here's a tough one. Is there a way to counteract parental alienation when one parent is encouraging a loyalty bind and the child is clearly being negatively affected? There seems to be no way to address it in a healthy way for the child. Parental alienation stuff is really, really challenging.
Mhm.
And I think this goes to some of what, you guys were talking about earlier in terms of control, right? If you have a parent that's engaging in that, you're probably not going to convince them to stop engaging in that. They're probably
Mhm.
going to continue to try. And so I guess the question for me is like, what can you do from your end to ameliorate that at all, to lessen the impact on kiddo when
Mhm.
you've got this stuff going on at the other house.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. I
Okay.
don't want to talk
No,
over
no, no, no. I love hearing all of your thoughts, Alex. This is great. I don't want to get in the way, to be honest. No, I think, yeah, again, this distinction between the controllables and uncontrollables, and what can we do in this household to make this as a hospitable environment as possible, a place this child enjoys being, all while acknowledging that there are these other dynamics at play that could be putting a lot of tension and stress on these young people. Just trying to ensure that the reality of this household is one that is marked by warmth and support. And so that as the child navigates some of these challenging dynamics, some of which we may not be able to fully control, they at least know that there is some refuge here. This is a place where we aren't going to be burdening you with those sorts of issues. This is a place that you can be comfortable. You're not going to have, elevated cortisol levels in this environment. That's just an initial
Mhm.
thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I think, the thing that really comes to mind the most for me is I think if you are, whether you're the parent or the step parent in this situation, it is so, so painful to know that your kids, other parent, co parent, and the other household is essentially like trying to poison the water hole all the time. It's extremely difficult. It's very hard to continue to hold. And the repetition, I mean, it can feel like, death by a thousand paper cuts of just like constant stuff coming in your direction. It's very painful. That pain is very real. And I think the work for both parents and step parents is to figure out how to stay steady, and that my parenting and step parenting approach does not need to change in reaction to the incoming
Yeah.
fire, right? Like this is that place where I think the step couple needs a lot of support, and whether that's, couples therapy together or step family coaching to learn tools to really take care of each other. This is where like a step parent and a parent really can benefit so much from learning the skills to really see each other. And for example, the parent to say to their step parent partner, I know, I know. This is so freaking hard.
Yeah.
I know this is not what you were hoping for when we made this family together. I know it's not what I was hoping for either. This is falling far short. Right. So it's again like
I love that, calling out
acknowledging
the
the
elephant a little.
reality. Yeah. Acknowledging the reality of like, this is not like there's Brady Bunch BS, flowers and rose colored glasses idea of step family. And then there's this, which is so not what we were hoping for.
Yeah.
And I'm still so glad to be doing this with you. I love you. I know who you are as a step parent to my kid. I know. I see you. And you know what? We got to trust that as our kid matures, our kid is going to see it too. Like
Yeah.
this is long game stuff.
It is. And that's the hard
Mhm.
part about it, right? Is that we have to play the long game.
Mhm.
Okay, so my co-parent and I were never married, but instead had an accidental pregnancy while we were dating. We're no longer together. Now we have an amazing 5-year-old daughter. I am currently in a serious long-term relationship with my girlfriend. Our daughter is starting to ask questions around the family dynamic and the story of how we got to where we are. Is it best to be honest about what happened, or is there another way to explain it? I love that question of trying to figure that out. What's the best
You
way
want
to
to
talk to a
feel
5-year-old about all this?
you want to feel that one, Cameron?
I mean, I think I'd love to hear, Todd, what the research says about, in terms of developmental age, kind of the best
Mm.
way to talk to a 5-year-old about all of these complicated things, right? I mean, to me, it seems like you want to be as honest as is age appropriate, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think children tend to be able to handle the truth better than we assume they will.
Yeah.
So a lot of it, it's kind of how we deliver it, how we provide the kind of container for them to process the information and create that kind of comfortable space for them to do that. Yeah, I think a lot of this might depend on whether or not that co-parent is still actively involved in their lives. I mean, some of these facts just might already be apparent, and we're just going to put a few puzzle pieces together for them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think there's ways to cater this to the child in a way that's developmentally appropriate and allow them to be curious, allow them to ask
Yeah.
questions. I think the truth eventually might manifest whether or not we want it
Yeah.
to. I just think there might be a lot of value in providing some scaffolding for that for this 5-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, also emphasizing that the most important thing about this dynamic is that they're loved and that they
Mm-hmm.
have lots of adults in their lives who love them and
Mm-hmm.
care for them and keep them safe and all the things that are important to a kid, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Okay. What do you do as the step parent when they come back to your house not wanting to communicate about things with their mom? I have been very open and I truly do want to know what goes on in her life when she's not with us because I just want to know her better. She is only 9, so I feel like it's hard to have that conversation with her. I've been in her life since she was 3.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where just my initial reaction is you might see 9, 10, 11-year-olds start to do this in any family, right?
Yes.
There becomes this growing tendency toward, private information, or at least just a
Mm-hmm.
more kind of partition delivery of information and who the intended audience is going to be, and this kind of growing sense of autonomy and independence. And so some of this could just be normative from a developmental perspective. So I think that might be validating and just saying, hey, it's something a 9-year-old might do regardless of the family structure they're a part of. But I think it's okay to follow their lead a bit and just make sure they know that you are always there to talk and to listen and to explore topics of interest to them. Continue to convey those messages that, hey, I'm a warm, supportive place for you to go whenever you want to talk about anything you'd like to talk about. And to the extent that remains consistent, it's probably going to be a place that child will continue to turn to when they're comfortable doing that with various topics. So some initial
Yeah.
thoughts.
And
Yeah.
I love that point, Todd, about I think sometimes it is important to ask yourself, is this a step family caused behavior, or is this
Mm-hmm.
because they're a tween and teen and we know that that is just hard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think it's been fascinating. So of my 4 kids slash stepkids, now we're merging into the third one, going into this phase of sharing less. And it's so interesting to see how, as kids move into this phase, what's so developmentally appropriate is this like back and forth. It's like the tide, like drawing near and close and pulling back, and drawing near and close and pulling back, and figuring out like for any of us parents that run a little on the anxious side, figuring out how to ride that wave versus get
Yes.
nervous, automatically assume that there's a problem, like, oh God, what did I do? It must be me, or what's happening at the other house? Something must be going on. And just holding space for things to like play out a little bit. And then, and like Todd was
Yes.
saying, like hold that warm space of like, I'm here. Like, there's nothing that I think moves the kid further from you and brings that tide into a retreating position than a nervous chihuahua anxious parent who's just like, what's going on?
Yes.
What's going on? You can always tell me anything. It's like, just take a breath, relax, trust the relationship, see how it
Yeah.
plays.
I love that.
Easier said than done,
Um,
but it can save you a lot of trouble.
I love that. We are running out of time, and I hate it because this has been such an amazing conversation and so many great questions. I'm going to ask one last question to kind of wrap it up, and that is, and I think this is a really interesting one. How do we talk to our kids about the mistakes that we have already made in trying to blend our family? We've all made them. And first of all, I want to say we all make mistakes, whether you're in a blended family or not. So if you're beating yourself up about having made some of the mistakes that we're talking about today,
Mm-hmm.
stop. Everybody's made them and it's okay. So, how do we talk to our kids about our mistakes?
Do it. To do it. Like you noted, parents of any kind, caregivers of any kind are going to make mistakes. And there's something
Mhm.
so powerful and healing when a caregiver can approach their children and say, I messed this up and I'm sorry
Yes.
about that. And I would love to hear your reactions to this. I'd love to talk about this. That is so powerful. Those
Mhm.
moments
Yes.
of correction, of repair. Dr. Becky, I think, refers to that as moments of repair. Um,
Yeah.
Mhm.
would love to see that happen in step families. Say, hey, we kind of maybe were quick out of the gate and things got a little off the rails. I'm so sorry about that. Here's some things I think I did to contribute to some of those issues. That that opens up huge opportunities for course correction, for
Mhm.
relationship repair. And so, exactly how you do it will depend on the age of the children and the nature of what you perceive as the mistake being. But I think just to not talk yourself out of doing that would be my advice.
Mhm.
Yes.
I would say lean into that. That's great.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I
I
think
love
that's
I love it too, and I think it is so healing, and there's something really powerful. I don't know about y'all, I'm Gen X. When I was growing up, parents didn't apologize.
Right.
You kids were always the ones that were in the wrong, and you never heard parents apologize. And one of the most powerful experiences for me when I became a stepmom was the first time I heard my husband apologize to one of the kids. I was like, wait, we can do that?
Mhm.
And it is really powerful when kids see that, like, hey, it's modeling such a wonderful quality
Yes.
when kids can say, hey, it's okay if I mess up. They're
Mhm.
giving me permission to mess up. And
Yep.
I think you can even say to a kid like, hey, I've been learning a bunch of stuff about step families, and I think we've done some stuff that we should revisit. And I wish we had done some things differently. And I'd love to hear as you said, Todd, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. I think that's
Mhm.
really powerful.
Yep.
Um,
No, I totally
yeah,
agree. I think the modeling is so important because it's like, how do we envision, like when we look at our kids and we imagine what our kids or stepkids are going to be like when they're adults, like what are the qualities and values and character traits that we're hoping that they can
yeah,
inhabit? We can model those things, and that's really, really powerful. And to me, sometimes that is like the motivation that I think a lot of parents need to do things differently and help like get over the vulnerability of doing those things differently, is really having that vision of like, how would I love my kids to show up in their adult lives, and how then can I do the vulnerable work of modeling that to them and
yes, yes.
owning the learning curve, man.
I love it. I love it. Alex and Todd, thank you so much. This has been a fabulous discussion. I feel like we have like 4 panels worth of stuff that we could talk about. But if you're still with us, if you still have questions or you want to just continue learning more, I definitely encourage you to find our panelists. They're both on Instagram and talk about these issues a lot. Todd is at Dr. Todd Jensen. Alex is at Alex Harrison, LCSW. I'm, of course, at Stepfamily Solutions. And then I'm sure you're all following Talking Parents, who thank you so much for co hosting this panel. Really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you.
so.